So we're going to start with a recap of some of the AngularJS stuff that I introduced last week, and then once we finish that, we'll go over APIs. I'll show you how to make calls to APIs using Postman, and then we'll see how to make those calls in JavaScript using Angular. So when I introduced Angular last week, it was in the context of making a simple to-do app, and then there were several things I mentioned that all Angular apps have. So by the way, the Angular script, we use the template to generate this file, and it's on the GitHub page if you're not familiar with it. If you go to ignore that. Okay. So if you go to the GitHub page, the template we use to generate that to-dos.html is in week 2. It's in so it's in the week 2 folder called template.html. So just like for Bootstrap, you had to include a specific CSS file to the Bootstrap CDN. You also had one for Angular. So this is the default stuff in the template I provided, and then we also have a script for Angular, and then the second script is the one we made ourselves for the to-do app. So I'd mentioned whenever you're using Angular, you'd always have a module, and then that module would have several controllers. For the example we did, we call the module function on the Angular object, and we call the module to-do app. So this is just something you do. You don't really need to understand right now why you do it, but whenever you're using Angular, you always have a module. That's how you create it at the top, angular.module. In this case, we call it to-do app. And whenever you do that, you go back to your HTML file and add this attribute to the HTML tag with the corresponding name here inside the ng app. And then we also made a controller, and we called it to-do control. And then in the body, the things we wanted to control with that controller, we put this attribute on the body tag and gave it the same name that we use here. So I mentioned some of the concepts I mentioned with data binding and the use of some directives. There were 2 types of data binding, one-way and two-way. With one-way data binding, you have some objects in the code, and you want to display it on in the HTML file, but you don't want the user to be able to modify those. That's one-way data binding, just one way from the model to the view. And then with two-way data binding, the user can change it and it affects the code, and if you change it in the code, it also affects the view. So as an example, so let me open this just so everyone is comfortable what that is. So this is what we were trying to do. A simple to-do app. You type an item in here, you click the add button, it adds it to the list. And then for all the to-do items you have in the list, it displays it here using data binding. So notice as we click this, it modifies the numbers at the bottom. That's two-way data binding. The user interacts with this, it changes a property in the code, and since that change also updates all of the things that depend on that. So going back to this, most of this is Bootstrap, so I'm going to ignore that. This is an example. So we had an input element. This is where we type the name of the new to-do item. Whenever you want to do two-way data binding, you have to use the ng model attribute. So a normal input element would just look something like this, for instance. Yeah, so it'll look like this, and it would just be a normal input, and the user can type stuff, but it's not necessarily saved. You still have to write JavaScript to interact with it. But if you're using Angular, by declaring the ng model attribute on it and giving it a specific name, you can have access to that thing in the code using scope dot and then the name that you gave it in the HTML file. So in this example, we call this new item. If you want to access it back in the code, you'd use scope.newItem. Similarly, if you define something on the scope object here, you have access to it in the view, but you don't have to call it on the scope object. So as an example, we define the add item function. All it does is check if the length of the thing you typed in the box at the top is greater than 0, then it adds it to a list of to-do items that we have here. So going back to this, if you type this and you hit add, it adds it to that list, so that's in the code. And since the list changed in the code and we're using two-way data binding here, it updated this list here. So you can define objects on your scope, you can define functions on the scope. So here we have a list of to-do items. Each has an action and a boolean to indicate if it's done or not. This function adds a new item. The complete count gives us the number of things that are complete, and incomplete gives us the number of things that were not complete. So I'm just doing an overview. We're not going into this exactly in detail because that's not the focus for today. If you go back to the HTML page, some of the directives I talked about. For the table, we use ngRepeat right here. So we have a table, the head is fixed, so we had each item and another column for if it's complete. And yes.
And with the filter function, so when you pass in the parameter item, that item dot done, what does it?
So filter takes a function, and that function is supposed to take an item and return true or false.
Okay.
So I use the lambda expression.
Okay.
So you can rewrite this if it's not readable enough, but this is just for each item, it's going to call that function. If the item is done, then it's part of the filtered list. Yeah, and I didn't show it here because the incomplete is just the complete, the total minus the incomplete. So that was a simple way of doing this. But the filter function, if you have an array, you give it a function and it calls that function for each item. If it returns true, then that item is part of the filtered list. If it returns false, then it's not. That's what this is doing. Back to this, so ngRepeat, you can use that to repeat. If you have a list or an array of things, which is what we had, scope.todo is a list, and we wanted to have a row for each item in that list. So that's why we did tr, so we wanted to repeat a row for each item, and in here the item is referred to as the object item. And this is an example of a one-way data binding. It just shows the text there. So you have a property in double braces. This is one-way data binding, and whenever you use ngModel, this is two-way data binding. So this is just to wrap up what we did. We're going to come back to this eventually, but for now.
So two-way data binding is when the user can change it?
Yes. When your user interacts with it, it updates the code, and if you change the code, it updates what the user sees. One-way data binding is only goes from the code to the view. Does that make sense?
So it doesn't change the data?
No. You can change it in the code, and the change will be reflected in the view. But the user cannot interact with it. They can only just see the value, for instance. They can't change it like a checkbox. A checkbox. Does that make sense?
Yeah. What was an example of two-way?
So the checkbox, when they checked it, it changed something from true to false, or false to true. That's interacting with it. So as they change it there, the corresponding object in here, if it was false, this becomes true. So they interacted with it and they changed it here. If you had done something else in the code to change this directly to true, for instance, it would update in the view. So if they change it to true, the checkbox will become checked. If you change it to false in the code, it will become unchecked. Does that make sense?
So is that two-way?
That's two-way, yes.
And what's one-way?
If you change it in the code, it shows in the view, but they cannot change it from the code. Sorry, from the view.
So like the count below is kind of
Yes.
one way.
Yes, one way. Yeah, they can only just see the value. They can't interact with it. So this is a summary of Angular. We'll get back to some of this later. For today's major topic, we're doing APIs. We'll start with the Postman tool. Did all of you install that? Postman? Okay. So we'll start with the Postman tool, and then I'll show you how to do the same thing with AngularJS. So it's customary to talk about HTTP verbs. So when you start talking about APIs, the first thing you usually learn is HTTP verbs. So when you go in your browser and you type google.com, your browser actually makes a request to the Google server using a GET. So these are the common ones that I usually use. There's a whole list of different verbs, but these are the most common ones. So when you want to get a specific item or a list of items, or you want to make a search query, for instance, on Google, you'd use a GET that retrieves some specific data. If you want to send data to the server, for instance, you just filled out your credit card information and you want to pay for something. When you hit pay, that makes a request to the server and gives it all that data. So post usually has side effects. That means if you call it multiple times, it can actually, so for instance, with the payment example, if you try to post multiple times, that can actually deduct from your account multiple times. Those are side effects. The get verb usually doesn't have side effects. And then if you have something on the server that you want to update, use a put request. And then if you want to delete something, use a delete request. So this is an abstract view of HTTP verbs. Again, there's a whole list of them, but these are the most popular ones. And we'll see some examples of this now. Okay. So if you didn't get Postman, that's the link to it. The description was it's a GUI platform for developing, testing, and documenting APIs. So we're going to see what that looks like right now. This stands for Application Programming Interface. Yes. The description in my head, or my intuitive understanding of it, it's like a contract. If a specific server says they have these resources and this is how you get it, anyone that wants access to it has to abide by that contract, for instance. If you have to call a specific function or give it specific details to get something, that's like the interface, how you interact with it. Does that make sense? Okay, so if you have the Postman tool, go ahead and open it. I don't know what that thing is. Okay. So I put a small server together. That's what we're going to be testing today. I call the catalog API. So I'll just describe it quickly and then we'll actually go and see how we can test it. Yes. Thanks. Okay. So note that link down. That's the API endpoint we're going to be testing. It's pretty much a list of items. Go ahead.
What's an API?
I guess it's I don't know the word. So for instance, when you want to get something from a Google, or when you want to go to Google, you type google.com. That's the endpoint. It's like the location of a specific resource you want. So the service we're going to be testing, I'd written that and deployed it to that URL. So it has a list of items. It's stored in a SQLite database. You don't have to worry about that for now, but all the items have an ID, which is an integer, a title, a description, and a price. And then these are the different, if you need to get the list of items, you use a GET request with that specific URL. And these are the other corresponding URLs for other things. We're going to go over it in Postman, so don't worry about it for now. I need to make sure it's running, so give me 1 second. Okay. That should be good. So before we start using that, we'll do a very simple example. So for instance, if you have Postman open, and you type google.com, for instance. So notice here we're doing a GET request. Use a GET request when you want to retrieve some kind of information from a server. So here I'm doing a GET request for google.com, and if you hit send, So it actually returns the HTML file that's usually displayed in your browser. So normally when you surf, you just go in there and type google.com. The browser makes a corresponding request to the server. The server returns the HTML page and all the accompanying files and then renders it as this. But in Postman, you can see what the raw thing actually looks like. So we did a GET request for the Google site, and then this is what the HTML file looks like. Does everyone understand this a bit? Okay. So the next example, we're going to use the cataloger API I just described. So go ahead and change the URL. Yeah, notice there's no triple W at the start of that. I think that actually affects it. And the first one we're going to test is /API/items. So the base URL is cataloger.azurewebsites.net. Then for those specific requests, you have to add just like this describes. If you want to do a GET, you have to add this to the end of this. And if you want to do a GET for a specific item, you'd put all this at the end. So if you do this and hit send, for instance, it returns a list of stuff that's saved on the server currently. Eventually we're going to go over how to add things and how to update things. So just like I described, it's a list of items. Each item has an ID, a title, a description, and a price. So I got these as random items off of Amazon. Okay, so this returns a list of items. One of the uses of API, so for instance, if you're Facebook, for instance, you'd have a mobile app for iOS, for Android, for Windows Phone, and for a whole bunch of other platforms. If you have some kind of common API, all your developers just need to know how that API works, and they can all get the same kind of information and display it in platform-specific ways. So it makes it easy for different teams to use the same kind of data and display it in different ways. So in your browser, for instance, it could show a whole lot of things. On a phone, which is a lot smaller, it's the same data, but it can be displayed in a different way. Yeah. So this example, when you call this, you get a list of items from the server. If you wanted to get a specific item, you have to use the same URL, but you add the ID of the item at the end. So right now, there's just 5 items with IDs 1, 2, 3, 4, and 9. We're going to use an ID that exists and an ID that doesn't exist and see what happens. So when you do 1, for instance, and hit send, is this working for all of you, by the way? So when you do 1, it returns just a specific item. And let's go ahead and try with a different ID. So, okay. And we also got an item, and then I'm going to switch it to an ID that does not exist.
What are you talking? Item / what?
The ID number. So for instance,
Just the ID number?
yeah. If you're not sure what the ID numbers are, just do a GET request for all the items and pick any of those. Off or on? You could, if it helps. Let me see if I can zoom in.
This is just a part of the HTML code, right?
Sorry, this is JSON. It's not part of the HTML file. This is data in the JSON format. So in JavaScript, when you make objects, you declare properties. It usually looks like this. For instance, in the code we did last week, this is how we declare the list of items. This is JavaScript notation, but the JSON format is very similar to that. I think it's actually from that. Yeah, so this is not part of the HTML file, it's just text, and then you could parse it and do whatever you want with the text. Is it more visible now?
Yes.
Does your server return the JSON or just
JSON.
or the Postman just make sense of the data?
It returns raw. So for instance, if you hit raw, this is what the server returned, one long string,
Okay.
and then Postman just makes it look pretty. Yeah, the server returns a string. Okay. So this is, we went over how to get multiple items, how to get a specific item. The next thing is how to create a new item. So for instance, If you want to add an item to that list, use post, and then the item you want to add, you have to put it as a you put the item in the body of the request. So for instance, if we go back in here, you can change the get to post. So again, this is a list of several HTTP verbs. We're just using the four most common ones. So we're using a post.
Is this like specific to this website?
No, you can use it to test any other API. So for instance, one of the examples we'll be doing later. I believe so, but I think you need, yeah, they have a bunch, but I think you have to sign up as a developer or something like that to be able to access it. Yeah, I'm not going over, because usually APIs are usually, you need authentication, for instance, because not anyone should just be able to call them. We're not going over authentication or authorization today. Let's have an understanding of how it works first, and then we can worry about that later. So an API I like to use when I introduce APIs is this. So for instance, right here, if you make a get request to this, it returns a random Chuck Norris joke. So if you just go ahead and copy that, Postman just makes it easy to test your APIs and makes it look fancy too. So if you change this to a get, for instance, and do this, you get a random Chuck Norris joke. For instance, this is the joke. Quite fun. So going back, so yes, you can use this to test any API, not just mine. But since I wrote mine, I know how it works and know when it wouldn't work or not. So I can use that for an example. Okay, so going back, we want to add an item to the server. So you're going to use a post because that's the API that this exposes. So post, and the item you want to add, you have to add it in the body of the request. So if you go back to Postman, by the way, let's note what an item looks like. If we do this one, again, each item has an ID, title, description, and price. When you're posting, it doesn't really consider the ID because that's something that's done on the server. It assigns the ID automatically, but you want to make sure you put the title, the description, and the price for this API. So you can go ahead and copy one of these unless you want to type it yourself.
What if we give it like the same ID as everything?
For post, so I wrote this API, so I know it's going to ignore it. I don't know if someone else's API accounts for that, but this one will ignore whatever ID you give it and assign another ID to it. So for instance, copy one of those, change this to post. So this stays the same, but since you're doing a post request, and you need to send an item to it, you're going to go to body, right? So at the top, so the thing at the bottom is for the response, and the one at the top is for the request. So when you hit send, for instance, you're making a request to the server, and then what it returns to you is a response, and that's what's shown at the bottom. Bless you. So at the top, you want to click body, and then select raw. So there's different types of data. Well, here we're sending a raw string, and then to make it easier for us to type, change that drop down to JSON, and then you can paste what you copied here. So again, this for posting, so we copied and pasted just because we want to avoid typing. We don't need an ID. Even if you put the ID, it's going to ignore it. Let's just get rid of it for now. And then, I guess, put whatever you want in there. By the way, the string lengths are restricted to 100. So if you do anything above that, the request is going to fail. So just type something reasonable. So this is my example, for instance, and when I hit, so again, this is the request, then at the bottom of the page you have a response. This is the response for the previous one. But when you hit send, for instance, it makes a request, and at the bottom, so this is the ID that it was assigned, 89. Does that make sense? So the server automatically assigns a new ID to it. And then sometimes you get cookies and headers, but we're not worrying about that right now. So when you create a new item, it saves that in the database and returns the created item to you. So although we didn't assign an ID here, we automatically assigned it one for 89. So if you want this specific item in future, for instance, you just go ahead and go back to your get request and put that ID right there. And you get the same item. Does this make sense? Everyone following?
What do you push after you push when you want to push the send?
Sorry, repeat that.
When you push when you want to post it?
I just did send. So for instance, this was the post. You put the body in here. I selected raw and JSON just so we can get the fancy formatting. And then you hit send. So if I do this again, it's going to add another item. So I mentioned post usually has side effects. So if I post this again, for instance, it adds another one, and this time the ID is 95.
What if nothing showed up in your screen?
Nothing showed up. Do you have, how long is the text for title and description?
Did you? Well, I had the idea.
Like you don't see anything at all? I'll just take a minute so I can fix it.
Never mind. Figure it out.
Okay. But yes, I don't know if someone else is calling the API, but as of yesterday, there were only 9 ID numbers assigned, and it's supposed to increment it. And we have 95 now. So something is. But yeah, after this, I'm going to deactivate it, so don't worry about that. Okay, so that's how you do a post. So I should get how to get a list of items, how to get a specific item. And again, this is just for this API. This is how I designed it. You could design yours to receive a string instead of an ID, for instance. So here we posted to create a new item. Something else you'd usually want to do is to update your list, a specific item. So if we let's see what you guys created. Okay. So since I created 2 with the, like, are you guys doing the same thing I was doing? You're supposed to do your own stuff. Now I can tell which is. Okay, I'm going to update one of these and change that X to Y, for instance. Yeah, I'll do item 90. So to update, you'd usually use a put request. Sometimes servers use a post for that as well. But I designed mine to use a put request. So to update, it's very similar to a post. But for this, you have to have the ID because it needs to know which item you want to update. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy item 90 and do a put request. And again, you go to the body for the request, set it to raw. You want to use JSON. So for this one, you need to specify the ID because it needs to know which item is updating. And then I'm going to change the title. And if you send, it should update that item and return the updated item. So now this item has been updated. If you want to verify, you could get the list again. Someone updating the same thing I'm updating. Pick something else and update. I'm doing 90. Pick something else. Okay, I'm going to do that again. Okay, item 90 was updated. I just need to verify that it's working. So it did work, so you can go ahead and update whatever you want now. So we've gone over get, put, post. The last of the 4 common HTTP verbs is delete. And for delete, you just specify the ID of the item you want to delete. You don't need to specify a body. So we're going to do, don't delete any of the first 4.
Wait, for put, does it read off the ID number, which one you're updating?
Yes, you have to specify the ID. That's how it knows which
Okay.
item to update. Yes. For post, you are creating a new item, so the ID wasn't important. But for put, yes. Okay. So again, don't delete the first one of the first 4. As you can see, those are really fancy items. Okay. So I'm going to delete item 90. And it returns the item that was deleted. And again, if you get your list of items, 90 should be gone. So yes, that's. But I've already deleted it. So if you try that again, it should fail. So for instance, this API, you just specify that URL /API/items/ the ID of the item you want to delete. So I wanted to delete item with ID 90. So I just put 90 at the end. And we're doing a delete. So if you want to delete something else, for instance, 85. Okay. So in this case, there was no item with ID 85, and this failed. So that's a general overview of how HTTP verbs work. Something I haven't mentioned yet is status codes. So if you notice, when I call get, for instance, we get 200 OK. And most of you should be familiar with full not found. So this is usually, when you make a request, you get a status code to indicate if it went well or if it didn't go well. In general, all the status codes starting with 2, so 200 to 299 are usually full OK, everything went fine. And then everything in the 500 range is if you had a server error, so if something on the server didn't work out right. And if you have a 400 error, that's when you have a client problem. So for instance, 404 is when you try to request a resource that doesn't exist, or you try to go to a URL that's not actually a valid URL. And there's a whole list of those. If you go on Wikipedia and type HTTP status codes, so this is like 200 is success, 300 is redirection, client error, server error, and then there's the whole list and description of what each of them stand for. Okay. So this is, I guess, an overview with Postman. The next thing we're going to do is see how we can make corresponding calls in JavaScript. Again, you use this when you're testing, but to use it in your actual application, you have to make, for instance, if you're writing a web application, you'd use JavaScript. If you're writing a mobile app in iOS, Swift, whatever language you're using, they usually have libraries to make web requests, and you get your data and pass it and display it however you want. So going back to the slides, we just went over this API. We're going to use the same API for the HTML app. But before that, so since we're using Angular, I'll briefly describe the HTTP service. We're not going into it in detail, just like the stuff we did last time. It's just to show you how it can be done. And then depending on whatever framework you choose to use in the future, at least you know what you're looking for when you're trying to use it. So with AngularJS, when you want to make HTTP requests, use the HTTP service. So we've been using the scope object and defining objects and functions on that, and we had access to it in the view. AngularJS uses something called dependency injection to provide that. I'm going to go over what that looks like in a bit, but to use the HTTP service, you declare it. We'll look at that, but the HTTP service is used to make, well, that's the description of that, to communicate with remote servers. So for instance, if you want to make a get, put, post, or whatever you want to do, you use the HTTP service in Angular. This is the most general form of it. You'd specify the method, the URL you want to call, and then you specify two functions. If it was successful, the first function is called, and then you do something with the response. If it wasn't successful, so if you had some kind of error, the second function is called. So again, we'll go over this in an example, and notice that each of those functions takes a response object as a parameter, and this is a description of that. So if it was successful, whatever result was returned, it will be stored inside a data object. You can actually get the status code, so 200 or 400 or whatever in there. So the examples we've done right now, those two JSON data. So the syntax you just saw with the braces and key value pairs, that's JSON format. Other formats include XML, that looks a little bit just like HTML code with tags, start and end tags. And then you also status text. So going back to Postman, when we saw 200, we saw like OK as the status text. A server can actually return a specific status text. So usually you don't want to use the general method. If you know exactly what you want to call, there's actually shortcuts that you can use. So for instance, you just want to do a simple GET request. You do that. We're going to ignore the config for now since we're not doing anything special. But usually if you want like authorization or you want to do specific headers, you'd put it inside the config object, but we're not doing any of that. Okay, so again, I'm just showing the first four, or the four most common verbs. All of them look the same. You have forget and delete. You don't need a body, so you just specify the URL and the functions to be called if it's successful or if there's an error. For post and put, because you usually have to send some data to the server, you have to specify the data after the URL, and then all of them just have a success callback and an error callback. Okay. So if you have Visual Studio Code open, or whatever IDE you choose to use, make a folder somewhere and open it in Visual Studio Code. I'm going to use the template we started with the last time, so that's on GitHub. Copy that same template.
Need to create a new folder? New folder?
Yeah, you can put whoever you want, but usually it's good to organize your stack. Okay, so I made a new folder. In my case, I called it live because I actually have the existing. I already tested this out, so sure I know what I'm doing. So I made a new folder. I'm going to make a new file, and I'm going to call it catalog.html. And then if you copy the contents of the template file on GitHub, just go ahead and paste it here. Can everyone see this clearly? Can you all see the screen?
Yeah.
So I pasted the template file. Again, that's on GitHub. If you go to github.com/frankebam, which is my name, and then go to the web dev repository. So that's, yeah, like seeing my face. Okay, so web dev week 2. There's the template file in there. Just copy the contents of that file. So this template already has the Angular scripts and Bootstrap in that. You'd have to supply yours. That's where you define the module and the controller and all the other supporting code. So I'm going to make a second file, catalog.js. So I have my dummy HTML file. I deleted the hello world in the body. And let's set the title to catalog. So once we have this, you want to include a script tag to refer to that that JavaScript file. And then we need to set the source. Again, the period and the slash in front is important.
What did you put
It's empty right now, but we'll go see what. Yeah. So if you open this file right now, you shouldn't see anything on the browser. It should just be a blank page. I'm going to open that. And we just have a blank page because we haven't added any content yet. So to test that everything is working, I usually use a one-way data binding. So for now, just go ahead and type 1 plus 2. So this should, if everything is working, this should give us 3 in the browser. But right now, we're going to see this. So if we refresh, we see 1 plus 2. So this is because, like I described, we haven't defined the module and we haven't defined the controller. So those are things we need to do next. So I'm going back to catalog.js. So it usually looks this way. So you on the Angular object, you call the module function. The first thing is the name of the module. So in my case, I'm going to call it item app and then an empty list. So this is how you define a module. And then the next step is to define a controller. But before we do that, once you have your module, you need to add the corresponding attribute in the HTML file. So I've defined this module up here with this specific name, item app. The name that you give it in the HTML file has to match. So if you go back to catalog.html, I'm going to set an attribute on the HTML tag, so ng app, and I'm setting it to item app. So we just define the module, which is one of the first steps. And again, the code for this is already on GitHub, so if you can't follow typing along, you can also look at it. So right now, if you refresh, it still shouldn't work because the bindings, all those should be on the scope object, which is in the controller. But we haven't defined a controller yet, so that's the next thing we'll do. So I usually just do this just to test that I'm doing everything right before you add a bunch of code and nothing is working. Okay. So if you go back to catalog.js, the module function returns something, and we're storing that inside this variable called app. And then on that variable, I'm going to call the controller function. So app.controller. And now you need to give your controller a name. So I'm going to use item ctrl for controller. So the next thing, so this usually looks the same. The next thing is to specify a function, and that function takes the scope object. So function scope $sign in front. And whatever code you put here, for instance, the controller has access to those. So with this, or with these few lines, if you go back to the browser and refresh it, this should give us 3 now. Oh, not yet. So we define the module and the controller. We put the module tag in here. We also need to specify the controller attribute. So I'm going to do ng controller and set it to item ctrl. So everything in the body is under the control of that controller. And now we can actually go ahead and evaluate all the data bindings. So in this case, I set the ng controller attribute on the body tag. And if you go back to the browser and refresh it, we should see 3. No? I lied. Okay. Let's go back and see what we missed. I think so. Let's see what's missing. Did all of yours work? Extra body tag. Sorry, just give me a second. It says there's an unmatched tag, so I'm guessing it's. I think this is fine. Let me remove everything and see if we can find what tag is missing. HTML head. Okay, so it's fine. Oh, yeah, it's mostly fine now. Let's go back and add those. Okay, so it's working now. Okay, so right now we'll show that we set up Angular correctly, and then we'll actually go ahead and try to see how the HTTP service works. So to use the HTTP service, the same way you declare the scope here, you just simply add that as an argument to this function. So you use HTTP with a $sign in front of it. So we're going to test this on the console first of all. We'll make a request and then we'll just log it to the console, and then we can worry about what it looks like later. So the syntax for making a simple GET request is this, http.get, and then you put the URL. We're not using the config and it's optional, so we're not going to specify that. And then we're going to specify what should happen if it's successful or not. So in here, well, to make it simple, let's add a button, and whenever we click the button, then it makes the request. So add a button to the HTML. So when you want to call a function, when something is clicked, you use the ngClick attribute. So I'm going to say ngClick, and let's call the function load items. Oh, it's a function, so we have to call the function. And then I'm going to call it load. And since we're using Bootstrap, so again, when you use Bootstrap a lot more, you start to know what classes that apply. If you're not sure, just go on the website. There's a whole list of examples. Okay. So we declared, or when this button is clicked, we want to call a function called load items.
It's not showing
What's not showing?
the value of 1 plus 2.
Did you get a similar error? Did you look at the console?
Yeah, no, I didn't put the console.
Sorry. Good. Anyone else have the error? Everyone else good? Okay, I think everyone else is good. Okay, go ahead and, I guess, declare a load items function on the scope. You can look at the code we had on the repository to see how to do that, and try to make a request using one of this syntax. I'll be right back. you didn't see before. Madison, you good? Any, if you have any issues, let me know. Okay, so going back to the JavaScript file, when that button is clicked, we want to call a specific function. And to be able to call a function, you have to declare it on the scope object. So I'm going to say scope.load items. Is that what I called it? Yeah. So I called it load items equals function. And inside this function, I'm going to make the HTTP request. So to do that, use the HTTP service. So http.get, and you have to enables binding. So whatever you declare on the scope, you have access to it in the HTML file. Does that make sense? So for instance, I want to call a function when the button is clicked. This is the function you want to call. This function has to be declared on the scope in order to be able to call it. Does that make sense? A little. If you go back to week 2's example, everything we did was defined on the scope. So the list of items, the new item, all of these were defined on the scope, and that way we could make calls to those. So for instance,
You had like different scopes.
if you're using multiple controllers, yes, but let's not go into that right now.
Well, so you have a scope for each controller?
Yes, but we're not using multiple controllers yet. Right now we're just using one. So we just have one scope object, and whatever you want to make accessible to the view, you have to put it on that scope object. Okay, so going back to this, the URL is HTTP. So there's actually a lot more stuff going on in the background. There's something called CORS, that's cross-origin requests, I think. Yeah, cross-origin request sharing. So normally you can't, the browser doesn't allow you to make calls to other servers, for instance. But I enabled CORS support for my API. That's why we're able to call it. It's not something we're going to go into detail, but it's something I thought I'd just bring up. Okay, so we're making our URL request catalog at azurewebsite.net/API/items. This will give us a list of items. And then we're not specifying the config thing. So again, if you go back in here, you put the URL. We're not doing any special configuration, so we're going to ignore this. And then you call then and give it two functions. What should happen if it's successful and what should happen if it's not successful. So below, just to make it look better, you call then. The first argument, like this, shows there's a function if it's successful, and the second thing is another function if it's not successful. So I'm going to do function success. To make sure you don't miss any of the braces or parentheses. So you can supply both of them, for instance. I'm going to ignore the error case because I know this should probably work. But if you want to do if you want to call some specific method, for instance, if you got an error, you'd specify the second function right here. So for instance, and if the request is successful, it calls the first one. If it's not successful, it calls the second one. So right now, going back to this, the response object, the data that you want is actually stored in the data property of the response object, as well as several other properties. But all we care about right now is the data. So if it was successful, we want to log the data. And if it's not successful, let's just log an error. Yeah, let's use that one. If it's successful, I just show it on the console. If it's not, I put an error message on the console. Everyone good so far? Okay. So if we go back to the browser, you need the console open, by the way. So go ahead and right click, depending on what browser you're using. If you're on Firefox, I think you have to do function key F12 to open. Oh, you have to open the developer tools. I think it's the same for Chrome, and then just go to the console tab. But if you refresh this site now, we have a button, and if we click this, it makes a request, and then we logged the output. So here we have an array of objects, and these are the different objects that are on the server. So for instance, the first one has these properties. Someone modified it. I told you guys not to modify the first 4 objects.
What was the shortcut for Mozilla?
Function key F12, yeah. Everyone good so far? So at least right now we know how to make a basic get request, and we did get a list of items. So if you wanted to show it in a table, for instance, we're going to go over how to do that quickly, and then I'll give you a short exercise just to make sure everyone is actually following. So right now this request was successful, so we logged the array of objects to the console. If you wanted to display the different objects in a table, so for instance, and before I go ahead, one good thing about Angular, you can start with static templates, for instance, what you want it to look like. And then once you add the Angular parts of it, you can add all the necessary Angular attributes, and then it just works without having to do a lot of work. So for instance, I'm going to put a line break, just put some space between the button and a table, and I'm going to use a table. And since we're using Bootstrap, so that when you click the button, it loads some data. We're going to update that to actually display the data that was loaded in the table. So each table has a head, and then the head has a single row, so one tr tag, and then it has, so in our case we have 4 properties: ID, title, description, and price. So I'm going to add 4 columns to this. So columns are TD elements. So this is the table header. As always, if you want to verify that what you're doing is working, you can go refresh your browser. And just to keep in spirit with Bootstrap, I'm going to add all the other stuff. So usually you'd have everything inside a container, and inside the container you'd have a row, and then you have a column, and then all your stuff goes inside the column. I'm going to add that quickly. So I'm going to do a div. This has class container, and inside the div you want a row, and inside the row you can add columns. So then I'm copying all the previous stuff, I'm putting it inside that column. So this is what we have right now. Again, most of this is Bootstrap just to make it look fancy. You don't have to. The important thing here is the AngularJS parts of it. So right now we just have a table header. We're going to add the body, and for that we're going to use the ng repeat directive. But right now, if you refresh the browser, you should see a table with just a header. So we have a table with the header. Now we're going to generate. So when you make the request, when you click the load button, we get a list of items. We want to display that list of items in the table. So is everyone good with this? This. So a button and then an empty table with just a header. Anyone else still typing this? Sorry, did you say something?
Yeah, hold on.
Okay.
Can you go back to the JS file?
Sorry, one second. We're about to go there.
So, how does this relate to the API?
When we make a call to the API, we get a list of items, right?
Yes.
We want to display that item in a table.
Okay, so we're displaying what's in the API or displaying the API?
You make a call to the API and it returns data. We want to display that data. So in this case, the data is a list of items. We want to display that list of items in a table. So everyone done now? So going back to the JavaScript file, here we just logged it. This is not really useful. So I'm going to remove that. If you want something to be accessible in the view, like I mentioned before, you have to define it on the scope. So on the scope, I'm going to add a property called items and set it to response.data. So again, response is a complex object with several things. One of it is the data, your status code, your headers, a bunch of other stuff. We just care about the data. So you do response.data. And in this case, data is a list of items. When I say list, it's an array of items, just like it showed on the console. So once we do scope.items equals response.data, this is now available for view. So it's now available for use in the view. So I'm going to go back. Everyone good with this? You good? You wanted to see this? Okay. So this is the JavaScript file. To repeat several items, you use the ng repeat directive. So I'm going to add a table body. And then I want one row for each item. So a row is a tr element. And since I want one row for each item, we're going to use the ng repeat attribute. So I'm just going to call each item in items. You could be more descriptive if you want to. The key point here is that items is the same as the one you declared in the scope right here, this. So items is your list of objects. And then for each row, you're going to refer to the current object as item. And now we want one column for ID, title, description, and price. So those we're going to use a one-way data bindings. We just want to display it right now. So I'm going to do item.id. So this just shows the value. The user can't interact with it. So Angular reduces the amount of work you have to do by declaring just a single element, in this case a tr element. It duplicates that for each item. If you're using some other framework, for instance, if you were using jQuery, you'd have to actually add elements to the DOM yourself. That's manipulating the DOM. But here, everything is simplified. You just think about what data you have, how you want to display it, and it takes care of all that for you. So here we have a table with the header, 4 columns. For each item in our list of items, you want to display these 4 items. And now if you go to your browser and refresh the page, is everyone good? Yes. Thanks. Okay, so if you go over to the browser and refresh this, again, you have to click the load button, and that makes the HTTP request. And then once it gets the items, it displays it in the table. So we do this, and now we have all these items. And you didn't have to do much, and everything is working. Does this make sense? Yes.
It shows HTTP is not defined in the console when I click load.
Did you add it to the, did you put it here? Okay. So Angular provides several services. Whenever you want to use that service, you have to add it as a parameter to that function at the top. I think the only services we're going to go about is HTTP for now. Did you have a question? Did everyone? So this is the HTML file, nothing fancy yet. I'm going to go one step further and allow us to be able to delete items, because right now we just have a whole list of items. So I'm going to add buttons to the side of each row, and then when we click that button, we want to delete a specific item. So we go back here, add an empty column to the header. So I just added this empty column, and then I'm going to add a button inside the last column. So for this button, I'm going to be a little bit fancy and use glyph icons. That's little icons. So again, when you need to do something, you just go on the Bootstrap website, and it gives you exactly how you want to do what you want most of the time. So if you go to getbootstrap.com, you want to add glyph icons. So if you go back to component, the very first thing you see is glyph icons. So for instance, if you want to add one of those, and there's a whole list of them, so if you want a specific icon, you can just search for it. Yeah, so how to use, skip all that stuff. This is what we're interested in. Are you guys on the website? I'm going to type it as well, so you'll see what I do. But usually I just come over here, copy, paste, and modify. Okay, so I'm going to copy this. In our case, we want the delete icon. But for now, we're going to paste it as the content of the button. So we have that glyph icon inside this button, like that. And then before we forget, when we click the button, we want to call a specific object or a specific function in the controller. So this time I'm going to call that function. So I'm going to use the ngClick attribute, just like we did for the load button. So when this button is clicked, I want to call the function called delete item, and an argument to the function is going to be this specific object. So remember, item here refers to the current item, so the item in this specific row. So when I click the button, I want to call this function on the scope. We haven't defined it yet, but we're going to go back and do that. And then since we want a delete icon, right now if you refresh the catalog website, we haven't implemented it yet, so it shouldn't work. Right now we have search, we want the delete icon. So if you go back to the Bootstrap site, scroll all the way up and search for delete or remove or something similar. So in this case it's trash. Yeah. So in this case we want this. So just search for words that seem or like synonyms of what you're looking for. In this case trash is what we want. So you just go back to this and replace glyph icon search with glyph icon trash. So we have a table, a row for each item, and a button to allow us to delete specific items. So again, we're going to define the delete function on the scope, and that function should take a parameter, which is an item to delete. So if you go back, does everyone have this down? If we go back to catalog.js, just like we defined the load items function, we need to define a delete item function. So below this one, so it's a function and it takes an item as a parameter, the item that you're going to delete. And just like we did the HTTP get, the delete just needs for the API that we're testing. If you want to delete a specific item, you just do all that stuff and the ID of the item you want to delete at the end. So here what we have is the object. That object has 4 attributes: the ID, title, description, and price. So we can get the ID from that object. So we're going to use the HTTP object again. So HTTP dot delete, and you have to put the URL here. So it's the same URL as the previous one. /API/items/ and then the last thing has to be the item's ID. So again, this specific API requires the ID of the item at the end. What this function gets is the object, which has 4 properties: ID, title, description, and price. But the URL needs the ID, so that's why we add it to the end of the URL. And just like we did before, you have to specify a function that gets called when it's successful or not. So then I'm just going to do the success function this time. So if it was successful, we need to remove it from our list of items. That way it goes away from the table. When you want to remove something from an array, what function do you use? Do you guys remember? Options, remove, delete, splice, slice. We went over this the last time in detail because I mentioned it's one of the important things you do. Yeah, no one? I guess I failed. But you use the slice function when you want to delete something. You specify the index of the thing you want to remove and then the number of items you want to remove. In our case, we just want to remove 1 item. So the first thing, we need to find the item. So I'm going to call index equals, to get the index of something in an array, you use the index of function. So again, the list of items is defined on the scope. So scope.items.index of. And just like that says, you specify the, well, in this case, I'm using an object. Yeah. Okay. So the object we want to find the index of is this item. And then once we have it, you can go ahead and do scope.items.splice. So you specify the index and the number of things you want to remove. So I'm going to do index, and we want to remove just 1 item. So why are we doing this? When you hit the delete button, it makes a request and deletes the item on the server. We haven't removed it on our table, it's still showing. So if deleting was successful on the server, then we go ahead and also remove it from the table on the client. Does this make sense? Okay. So if you save this and go back, don't delete the first 5 items. Okay. It took a long time to type this stuff. I don't want to do it again. So if you refresh the page, you hit the load button, it gets your list of items and displays all of them with the delete thing at the side. So yeah, someone already messed one up, so I'm going to remove that first one. So when you hit delete, it makes a request. It was successful, so it removed it from the table. Did everyone see that? If you didn't, I'm going to repeat it. Oh, these two are blank. 333. What's going on here? Okay, so if you hit delete, it makes a request and that item is gone. If you wanted to verify that it was working, you can hit load again, gets all the item, redisplays it, and the ones we delete are actually gone now. So that's how you do a delete. It's very similar for put and post. But I want you guys to do an exercise before we look at those. Is it you? Okay, so we're going to take some minutes to do a very short exercise from the Chuck Norris API. So, did everyone get this, by the way? Okay. So, this is what you're going to do. So the description of how this API works is on the site. So I want you guys to go on there and see how it works for yourself. But what you need to do is, at the button, when you click the button, you need to make a request and get a random joke and display it. Each joke has specific things in it. But I want you to look at the API and see how it works and try and figure out if you can make something like this. So whenever you hit the random button, it generates a joke. You know, don't worry about the glyph icon to the left of it. Just make it work, and then you can make it look fancy later. Or when you click the button, it should generate a joke, display it, and the icon on the left side. If you click it again, it should get another joke. So everyone try to work on that. If you have questions, let me know, and I can come and see. Sorry, 1 second. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I mentioned it's still not loading.
The
When I click the load button, it's still not loading.
Okay, does everyone know the objective? Okay, so go ahead and try to work on that. You go to the code. Do you have any code? Save this one. Did you give any specific error?
Jupyter console lines.
Are you logging? Did you try logging? I started with that because you don't have to work on that. Logging. If it works, then you can do it.
No, how do you do it?
If you type the type without the name, just like go to TV time, just type TV, type twice.
Oh, tap twice.
It works twice, but whatever. Yeah. Yeah. And then I'll shut that down. Type it. Items, you put the you can't have it, but sometimes it takes. So you do get the correct number of items because there's no showing the stuff. So then let's just use item, not items. Because items is the list. So we're using this for a specific
Item dot.
Yeah, for a specific item. Is it nonsense? Yeah. Yeah, you missed the line. I remember something. So again, this items as defined on the screen. Items is the list you get from the cell. So as long as the data is not real items, just put it understood. Yeah, this is you can start with how when you do the console, that the code in the console.
I didn't try that.
The 1 plus 2 code.
Yes, I did. I'm sure it's just fast. It's spelled mistakes or something. You will do.
So this part, you're saying for every item in table spaces, how does it know? I mean, if I change item to X, will it still work?
Yes. Yeah.
I
So
just call
this
it
is the
items.
important part. This, the in.
Oh.
So if I change this to Y,
I'm sorry, bro. This is my
that's
best.
absolutely.
My best. I feel.
Okay, so these items, it's
Ah, it's always just small error.
okay.
Every time.
Now let's try this part.
Honestly, let me see.
Thanks.
You get good?
I know.
Did you have some problem?
Yeah, we fixed it.
For now, we just set it out. Usually you hide it to make sure when you get this stuff, but we're gonna clean the object so it's fine, so you can it's fine. You guys should do it, that's fine. You guys get that one? It's fine, it's in problem. It's fun, like, if you can just get the text from the video, that's also fine. But then the button is filled. the rest of you, I'll just quickly go over the solution to the exercise, and then we can call it a day. Okay, so most of it is just Bootstrap stuff, but other than that, it's a GET request just like we did here. If you go over to the website, if you want to get a random joke, so it's the very first link. So that part is simple. And then what you get is an object with these things: an ID, a URL, a value, and an icon URL. So for the image on the left, you use the icon URL, and then for the joke itself, you use the value. Does that make sense? So in my API, it was each item had ID, price, title, and description. In this case, these are the 4 things we get, but we only care about the icon URL and the value. So the API has lots of more stuff. We can actually get jokes by categories, a list of all the categories and stuff, but we don't need any of that. We just need the very first one. So if you go back to Visual Studio Code, this is what the HTML looks like. So all the usual stuff. I just added some styles to put space in between stuff. Ignore that. Again, mostly Bootstrap. The things to pay attention to, this button. So when we click the button, we need to load a joke. So we use the ngClick attribute and specify the function to call. So that function makes a HTTP request to the Chuck Norris API, loads a joke, and then it should display it down here. So here all I do is add an image tag. So to display an image, use an image tag, and then you set the source attribute to a link. So here I called it image. That means I must have defined something on the scope called image. So you could have done yours in a totally different way. As long as it works, that's fine. And then down here, I defined something else called joke. So again, whenever you do data binding, that thing has to be defined either on the scope or in an object on the scope. So I have an image. This is columns 3 and 9. That's how we had the image on the left and the text on the right side.